Thank you all for joining Darien Library this afternoon for Fiorello La Guardia, lawyer and politician of the people and for the people, with Mark Nunan. Mark was born in Cork, Ireland, and moved with his family to Alabama at an early age. He graduated from the University of Alabama and continued his studies at Stanford University, where he was awarded his master's in 79 and his PhD in 83. Mark has worked with American, European, and Asian private sector business clients and public sector partners in a wide range of industries, from public infrastructure and engineering to aerospace and defense. Before we begin, I'd like to mention that programs at Darien Library are made possible by the annual Friends of the Library campaign. We thank you for your continued support to make programs like this, as well as our collections, available to the public. I hope everyone's ready to learn about Fiorello La Guardia. And Mark, you can take it now.
Thank you very much, Pat, and welcome everybody to the second session of Building New York. Fiorello La Guardia was the 99th mayor of New York City. The first one dates back to the 17th century. He was the first mayor of the 12th mayor of the new New York City, which was the consolidation of the outer boroughs with Manhattan and the Bronx in 1898. And that led to a lot of problems that he helped to solve. He was the scourge of the old order, particularly Tammany Hall, the political machine in New York City, and an inventor of the new city, as we'll see. Not just a new order, but a new type of city that he believed in. If we look back, New York in the 1930s was a growing city with new buildings like the Empire State Building and the Chrysler Building. It still had elevated trains, and there's Macy's over here, and also had the great New York Yankees with Babe Ruth and Lou Gehrig. Gives you an idea of the times he lived in. This headline from the New York Times is a month after he took office, and you can see that he's already being challenged by the unions with the various strikes with the taxi, the buses, and the hotels. He also was challenged by nature. New York City had its worst blizzard in about 50 years in 1934. As you see, they had to get out the horse and buggies to start clearing up the snow, even though they had these new model automobiles in their police and fire and sanitation departments. They still had things like old rail trolleys, and New York was one of the biggest, most active ports in the world. You can see all these piers over on the Hudson side and on the East River side. LaGuardia helped to expand that activity also. So who was he, and why was he named Fiorello? There's two words here that are important: rebel and rabbi. On his father's side, he was an Italian born in the boot of Italy, in Foggia, to a Catholic family of municipal officials. Achille was his name, and he ran away at age 13. He did not like the strictures of the society he was living in. He had great musical gifts and became a musician and a band conductor, which allowed him to travel pretty much all over the world by the time he was 30. He'd been to Switzerland, to Indonesia, US, Austro-Hungary Empire, and he learned 2 additional languages because of that, English and German. He went back to Trieste in northern Italy and married a woman named Irene in about 1879. She was the daughter of, or her grandfather was this famous rabbi, Samuel David Luzzatto, known throughout Europe. He's one of the leaders of the Jewish movement of the 19th century. He translated the Talmud from Hebrew to Italian. He published in various languages, poetry, linguistic treatises, biblical scholastics, and other things. Fiorello was born in Greenwich Village when his parents moved back there in 1880. He was born in 1882, 17 years after this rabbi's death. He was named after his maternal grandmother, Fiorina, who was the daughter of this rabbi. And as the Jewish law would say, they would consider him a full-blooded Jew because on the matrilineal side, his family was Jewish. but he never practiced Judaism, and his father never practiced Catholicism. In the end, he became an Episcopalian. He always felt he was a boy of the Wild West. He was born in the Greenwich Village, but they left when he was 2 years old. So his formative memories are of the West. They started in the Dakotas, and then they transferred to Prescott, Arizona, which he really considered his home. He grew up there. His first memories were there. He had a lot of friends there. Here he is in the middle of two of the soldiers, friends of his father, from the base in Prescott. What he saw there upset him. He saw a lot of exploitation of Mexicans, Native Americans, and Chinese laborers by contractors and government agents. This was the time of building of the railroads and of the sort of growth of the West, where a lot of these immigrants came in and were severely exploited. He often got into physical and verbal fights. He was always a fighter and a scrapper from day one. Defending himself, people would call him Shorty. He was a very short man. When he was an adult, he was only 5'2", and they would make ethnic slurs about him. And he also fought on behalf of these other underdogs. And there's one story that's kind of funny. He was fighting this rather tall boy, and he couldn't hit the guy in the face. So he ran into the schoolroom, grabbed a chair, ran back out, got on the chair, and now said, okay, now we can have a fair fight. His father taught him music. He played the trumpet, the banjo, and the cornet. He also learned horsemanship. When he was a teenager, he thought of becoming a jockey because of his short stature. But most importantly, he read Joseph Pulitzer's The New York World. And it was full of information about Tammany Hall and the machine politics in New York City and the scandals around that. There were a lot of investigations in the 1890s when he was growing up. So this kind of prepared him for real windmills to tilt at, not like Don Quixote. These weren't fake. But there was a tragedy that came their way during the Spanish-American War. His father, as a band leader, was going to go to Cuba. He tried to enlist too at age 15. They didn't let him. But he convinced the St. Louis Post-Dispatch to make him their war correspondent, to go with his father to Cuba. But unfortunately, the father and many other soldiers ate something called embalmed beef, which was indeed embalmed with toxic chemicals. It was tinned meat. And unfortunately, many of these guys died. More died from this than from battle. His father did not die, but he got severely ill. And he also contracted malaria. This was in Tampa, Florida. There was a lot of malaria in that area at that time. So he learned this lifelong hatred of war profiteers, chiselers, cheats, and tin horns, as he called them, and he never forgot it. The family went back after this to Italy, starting in Trieste, where his father recuperated at the in-laws' family home there, but he died within a few years. At this time, Fiorello was able to become fully fluent in Italian. The parents had not allowed the children to speak Italian at home because they wanted to assimilate them to the US. Plus, he learned German, Croatian, and French. When his father was ill, a friend of his father helped him to get a job in the US State Department. He was a clerk at the consulate in Budapest when he was 19. He stayed there for a year or two and convinced the consul to give him the job of consular agent at FIUME, which is now Rijeka, Croatia. It's just a few miles from the Italian border. So he was the big man there at age 21 and quite enjoyed himself. But he really suffered, again, like he did in Arizona. He saw immigrants returning from America financially and spiritually devastated because they had failed health tests on US arrival. When they get to Ellis Island, they would give them tests for particular diseases which were highly contagious. And if they had them, they'd send them back. So he logically thought, why don't we do this before they leave so they won't spend all that money and be so broken when they return. He asked for permission. It never came. So he just went ahead and did it. This upset the consul general and, more importantly, Cunard Lines, who were carrying these passengers back and forth and got paid to ship them both ways. So after a few years, he decides, well, I'm not going to make it as a diplomat. The boss is really not too keen on him either. But as I say here, he'll fly high in spite of that. This is him actually in a plane. He became an amateur aviation enthusiast and he learned to pilot. So that was useful to him later, as you will see. He goes back to the US. He decides, I really want to go back to New York City, even though he really didn't have much memories of it. He had left it when he was 2 years old. Because of his language skills, he became an interpreter at Ellis Island. On a busy day, they would have over 10,000 passing through. And the second year he worked there was the busiest ever, with 1.25 million immigrants passing through. At the same time, he entered NYU Knight Law School, and he had to get a GED diploma before he could do that, because he never got out of high school when he left Arizona. And his final year in law school, he was a night court interpreter. They transferred him from Ellis Island to the courts. And this gave him a real view of Tammany Hall corruption at work, because these guys would basically shake down the new immigrants with various kinds of fees and things like that. So he got very upset about that, obviously. And in 1910, he passed the bar. He opens his ghetto law practice. He starts fighting Tammany as a labor lawyer, especially for the garment workers. He lived in the village himself in a tenement, but he made many new friends among the artistic community, including Enrico Caruso, and labor and political activists and many entrepreneurs. And this emblem over here on the right is a cartoon by Thomas Nast, picturing Tammany Hall as a tiger mauling Columbia. Columbia was the female representation of America. So they did not have a good reputation, but they had a thorough lock on the politics of New York City. So he joined the Republicans. I joined the Republican Party because I could not stomach Tammany Hall. And he became a pretty much well-known person within that group that started speaking publicly. He was an advocate. He was a lawyer that could help out. He decided to run for Congress in 1914 from his district in Greenwich Village. The sitting congressman was a Tammany guy named Michael Farley. And LaGuardia basically took the role of the candidate because nobody else wanted it. They never beat these people. But he came pretty close. So it was kind of a surprise, and it was kind of a future, you know, what was going to happen next. So 1916, it did happen. He was the first Republican to win this congressional district, upsetting the Tammany guy. He was the first Italo-American, as they called him, congressman. And in Congress, he was both a patriot and a gadfly. This was one of the most important Congresses probably since the Civil War, because it authorized our entry to the First World War. It happened to be evenly divided between Democrats and Republicans, with 5 independents and progressives. He voted with Republicans. He voted yes on the declaration of war and on conscription, the draft. The opposition taunted the people who votes yes to put their lives where their votes are by enlisting. And he is one of 5 congressmen who stood up to offer to do this, and one of only 3 who was actually accepted into the military. The other 2 were too old or had medical conditions. He had allowed no vote to the Espionage, Sedition, and Trading with the Enemy Acts. These were the Wilson administration's attempt to completely quash all opposition to the war. He was a very vocal opponent of this. As he said here, we need to curb the hysteria so we did not destroy in the war we were now engaged in the rights we were anxious to preserve. And he was very right. These laws resulted in over 2,000 arrests, 800 imprisonments, almost none for espionage. Most were political foes of the sitting president, including a House member, Victor Berger, who was also a newspaper publisher, which was a double threat. As he said, you got nothing out of the war except the Spanish flu and prohibition. We should have to drain the swamp. So there were 2 sides of the argument, but obviously the dominant argument was pro-war. Eugene Debs, who was a presidential contender who had gotten 6 million votes in one of the other recent elections against Wilson, and over 100 labor leaders. These were just a way to kind of stop any kinds of contention against the war. And he voted no to the Volstead Act, which was prohibition. He thought it would penalize the working people, create criminal organizations, and the bootleggers and their politician friends would do great, but not anybody else. So he did enlist. He became a flying congressman and at the same time an Italian orator. Here's how this happened. He had learned to fly, as we've seen earlier, from Giuseppe Belanca, another Italian who was an aircraft designer who lived in Long Island and was one of LaGuardia's law clients. So he signed up for the new Air Corps, and they accepted him because he had some experience, even though he was a little bit old, 37, 36. And before leaving as a congressman, he helped to pass the appropriations bill to set up the new military air service. It was one of the largest military appropriations to that date. But he fought and won any new orders, not doing any new orders of the Liberty motor. The pilots called it a flying coffin. It was not very safe. It was defective. So he was one of the few people in Congress to see this because he knew how to fly. And his oratory is another matter. He met there Thomas Nelson Page, who was also known as Sir Thomas of Shenandoah, a great courtly Virginian, US ambassador to Italy, best-selling novelist. And he asks LaGuardia to please go around to the major cities and give speeches to the Italians. They're totally demoralized, and they're afraid that we in the West are not supporting them the way we are the French. So he did this, and it was an enormous success. As one of the spectators said, he looked small, but when he started to speak, he became a giant. Even the king, Victor Emmanuel, invited him to dinner and awarded him the highest Italian medal. And he also, through this period, got to know many of the key figures in Italian government and among the American Expeditionary Force leaders in Paris. So what were his roles here and how did this help him? It taught him ever increasing responsibility. When he arrived, he was captain and second in command at the training center in Foggia, where his father came from. Then they moved him as a major and commanding officer of the combat division, the flying combat division, and as a pilot and bombardier at San Pelagio, which is in the northern Adriatic coast, 9 miles from his mother's home. It's incredible that both of these places were associated with his family just by coincidence. He was also the US Army representative for the Joint Army and Navy Aircraft Committee in Italy. So he was responsible for aircraft and materials procurement. Again, he was a public speaker, as we saw. And probably most important to his flyboys, he was a BS detector and lifesaver. And if we look at each of these little initials here, the SIA was an Italian manufacturer of very shoddy aircraft. The US had contracted to buy a lot of these. When they tested the first one, it fell apart in midair, the pilot died. So when they started delivering to LaGuardia's base, he refused to accept them. He wouldn't sign the receiving order, the manifest. So they had to send them back. This other one, sexually transmitted diseases, he knew that the soldiers, when they went on leave to Rome, would be going into the red light district. So he asked his medical officer to set up a medical clinic in the district to be able to provide prophylactics. The guy refused because it wasn't in the military manual. So he threw him in the brig, got another military officer who would do this, and together they set it up, and he had women push baby buggies around the district with prophylactics in them so the guys would take them. And interestingly, none of his people got any sexually transmitted diseases, which was immediately noticed by the people at the headquarters. And they asked him how he did it. Once he explained, they started replicating that in some other bases. Similar thing with catered food. The Italians were contracted to provide all the meals. Because they were so out of money and out of food themselves, the stuff they were providing had very little protein. So he figured the men are going to get sick. And so he contracted outside. When this got up to the boss in France, they threatened to court-martial him. But when they realized why he was doing it, he convinced them this was the right thing to do. Same thing with malaria nets. Foggia, where he was first, is a very malarial area. It's very swampy, apparently. And he had seen what happened to his father in Tampa. So he immediately bought malaria nets to put in the tents of these guys. And he only had one case of malaria. The Italians laughed at him when he was putting the nets up, but soon they realized he was right. And again, this got attention at the top brass. And they decided to do this at other bases where malaria was a threat. Lastly, he was a smuggler. Spain was a neutral country, but Italy was running out of steel and wood and other supplies to make aircraft. So he figured, let's get some money together, find somebody in Spain who can help us to get these materials. Because it was neutral, it had plenty of them. It was not supposed to sell to either belligerent. But there was this guy, Senor Taha, by far the greatest victim of U-boats was his Taha line. And more importantly, his son had been killed in one of the boats that went down. So he was very eager to help LaGuardia. He helped him get the right contacts of manufacturers to purchase the materials and to send them back to Italy in his own boats. So as Thomas Kestner, his principal biographer, says, he had gone off to battle a vaguely known freshman congressman. In Foggia, he became an experienced leader who commanded men, negotiated with foreign governments, served as a popular spokesman for the American cause, and earned a chest full of medals to boot. At the end of November, he went back to New York. He won his second term because the war was just ending then. Even Tammany Hall supported him. He'd become a national celebrity, was a war hero. They really couldn't put up anyone against him. Interestingly, riding high like this, after about a year in Congress, the Republicans come to him and say, look, we'd like you to run as president of the New York City Board of Aldermen. It's the second most prominent position to the mayor, and it had real power. It wasn't just a rubber stamp thing. He agreed to run on their promise that he would be the Republican mayoral candidate in 1921. He thought he could win. So he left Congress, and through this system of aldermanic governance, he began to get a really close view of the corruption of the city government, Tammany Hall, and the aldermen themselves. So he starts investigations of the comptroller and how he awards city contracts. And within 2 years, he got 69 Craig associates and contractors convicted and sent to prison, though not the comptroller himself. He got a lot of results, but he was totally disgusted with the whole system. The Republicans started turning on him because they saw he was doing much more than they expected him to do. He was far too insurgent for their tastes. And they reneged on their nomination promise. So he decides not to run again for the alderman job. Instead, he runs in the mayoral primary against the Republican candidate. He lost the nomination, but to his consolation, Curran, who was the Republican, loses to the existing sitting mayor, Red Mike Hyland, who actually came to admire LaGuardia very much, watching him handle the alderman. As he said, no more efficient, no fairer or conscientious man ever held office in city government. There is no office or gift of the people that is too good for you. And he meant it. So now he needs to go back to another job. He decides to go to a new congressional district. He moved from the village to East Harlem. The Republicans realized this was an ideal district for him. It was full of different ethnicities, the largest being the Italians and the Jews. He had the most Italians of any district, so he would get that vote, but he also had to get some of the Jewish vote to win. So the Democrats put Henry Frank, a Jewish, well-known, respected New York politician. But Mayor Hyland, because of what he'd seen with the alderman, broke with his own party, endorsed LaGuardia, and most importantly, he sent police to guard the ballot boxes against Tammany Hall's typical stunts of stealing votes. And very important too, Henry Frank made a huge mistake that backfired on him. He sent this postcard to all the Jewish voters in the district, claiming that he was the only Jewish candidate in the race, and the others are Carlin, who was a socialist and who he called an atheist, and second, the Italian LaGuardia, the Republican, who was a pronounced anti-Semite and Jew hater. Of course, LaGuardia had a fit when he heard this, because he was half Jewish himself. But it gave him a golden opportunity. Frank did not speak Yiddish. LaGuardia did. So he published an ad in the local Yiddish language newspaper. Very well then, I hereby challenge you to publicly and openly debate the issues entirely in the Yiddish language. This was a disaster for Frank because he had to decline, he did not speak Yiddish. LaGuardia went anyway to all the Jewish groups speaking in Yiddish, and it won them over. He even got the rabbis on his side. So it was a checkmate, and he won the election. And you'll see how small this district is. It's basically 1 square mile, but extremely densely populated, 250,000 people. So he could literally walk his district and meet his voters day by day, as opposed to someone who lives in the West or Texas, where you might have a district that's hundreds of square miles. So he went back to Congress for 10 years. And the first part of that period was a coalition building among progressives. And one of their key points was similar to one we hear today. It is unwholesome in any republic that 5% of the nation's citizens own 80% of the nation's wealth. Only a well-fed, well-housed, well-schooled people can enjoy the blessings of liberty. He understood the Constitution, particularly for these poorer immigrant groups, to be able to lift them up to a higher economic level, to avoid anarchy and things like that, or social envies and so forth. And why this happened was there was this enormous immigration wave of 25 million people in the previous 40 years. And 2/3 of those passed through Ellis Island in New York City. Many of them stayed there. So by 1920, New York had added an additional 400,000 Italians, 1.1 million Jews, Eastern Europeans of all kinds. So this was really a polyglot ethnic city. And they were mostly poor, dwelling in tenements, which was a large part of New York City's housing stock. But by now he realized himself he can no longer just be a gadfly. He needs allies to pass legislation. So he joins a new progressive alliance with this Senator Norris from Nebraska. And he led it in the House, Norris led it in the Senate, and it kind of combined all these different groups, the farm, labor, urban progressives, in a common cause, in a new coalition that really is a precursor to the New Deal. I mean, 10 years later, the New Deal gets started, but these guys were already fighting the battles, particularly against Secretary Mellon, Presidents Coolidge and Hoover, even though they were Republicans and nominally in his party. He felt that their taxation policies were regressive and hurt the working people. So, of course, once again, the old guard in his own party reject him. They didn't want him to run again. So he ran as a socialist this time in 1924, and he got a landslide victory. So the Republicans kind of realized we're stuck with this guy. So from 1926 on, he said, he went back to the Republicans, and when he won that election, he said, it's still better to joke about being a lone Republican from New York than a lone socialist in Congress. And in 1929, he finally gets the opportunity to have the Republican nomination for mayor against Jimmy Walker, who people called Bo James. He was very dapper, popular, but very corrupt Tammany Hall mayor. LaGuardia spent the campaign detailing and calling out Walker's political and criminal excesses. He lost the election, but he set the stage for Walker's downfall. We'll see that in a minute. In the last few years in Congress, he got a lot done. These progressive coalitions paid off, particularly with the Norris-LaGuardia Act, but also other New Order forays, you might call them precursors to the New Deal. He and FDR got along very well. He called him our Churchill because he had criticized the dictatorships in Europe and their treatment of European Jews. This is just a few quotes against Stalin, Hitler, and Mussolini. He'd been doing this criticism back in the 1920s. He was one of the first. And during his own congressional wilderness years, he was working on a series of innovative reform legislation, and not just on social issues, but on consumer, financial, and national infrastructure. For example, the Tennessee Valley Authority, which was critical to the progress of the southern states. He would go to these states and learn what the people were trying to do and why this was important. The Boulder Dam, which later was built as the Hoover Dam. The National Labor Relations Act. He would go to Pennsylvania and West Virginia to talk to the miners and the labor leaders there. The Federal Housing Act, which he knew a lot about from his experience with New York housing. Old age pensions, unemployment and health insurance, bank deposit insurance, very sort of before their time things, but which were coming again in the next decade. And of course, he's very close to the heart, Columbus Day, which FDR finally declared. Yesterday's hero, today's statue to topple. Sad, but true. The Norris-LaGuardia Anti-Injunction Act was his really signature legislation achievement. It eliminated catch-all injunctions against labor action. So what the large corporations would do, as soon as somebody threatened to strike, they would go and get an injunction because they would say it would cause violence. And what this says is, no, you cannot actually do that. until there is violence. And this was a precursor to the Wagner Act of 1935. So soon he is a lame duck congressman, but this gentleman, Cactus Jack Garner, who was the vice president-elect with Roosevelt and the House Speaker, named LaGuardia to work with the Senate to start preparing New Deal legislation during the lame duck legislation session, which was longer then because the president wasn't sworn in until the early March of 1933. So they had 3.5, 4 months. And some of the successful bills were the Reconstruction Finance Corp, the Glass-Steagall Extension, the Emergency Relief and Construction Act, the Federal Home Loan Bank, and many, many more. And there was a list of bills that basically he and these senators had prepared for Roosevelt to get passed when the new Congress came in. It was filled in 6 closely spaced type pages. President Hoover, he fought against him when he tried to put a new sales tax on manufacturers' goods. He thought that would hurt the working people. And he prevailed. This tax did not pass. It was really a turning of the tide. And the last turning in the lame duck session was the passage of the 21st Amendment, repealing prohibition, done about 2 weeks before Roosevelt took office. And this raised his stature, LaGuardia's, even further. He became known as America's congressman. He went home with lots of accolades, recognized as the leader to prepare the way for the New Deal in the House, and is pretty much a prophet for the past decade. So he was well known nationally, not just locally. And finally, he does become mayor. And that's pretty much due to the actions of this gentleman who I call his patron saint, Samuel Seabury, and the fusion party that was created around him. We remember in 1929, he ran against Walker. He had asked Roosevelt, who was governor, to investigate gangland ties to the mayor. Roosevelt did not want to do that to upset Tammany because he was running for president soon. So within 2 years, though, he had to do it because payoffs to judges and other people became obvious to the public. And he named Seabury, this gentleman with the halo over his head here, as the head of those investigations. He was a well-known blue blood New Yorker with Mayflower ancestors, impeccable credentials. And he did not just investigate the government malfeasance, he extended that investigation to Tammany itself. And he brought down judges, mobsters, the county sheriff, finally Mayor Walker himself, who had to resign and fled to Europe, while his broker, who was his bagman, fled to Mexico. So this was a huge sea change in New York City politics. It was a low point for Tammany. And LaGuardia was given credit for having basically activated this. In 1933, there was a fusion party established to bring together reformers, Democrats like Seabury, labor, progressive Republicans, and even some of the old guard Republicans. And Seabury was the obvious candidate for mayor. He did not want that job. And he thought LaGuardia would actually be better for it. So he backed LaGuardia. But behind closed doors, the fusion committee said he was too ethnic, too insurgent, always the same criticisms. So they looked at a dozen other candidates and they settled on Robert Moses, but they had not consulted Seabury at all. So they had arranged a luncheon with Seabury and to tell him this, and this really unflappable guy, he had a total fit. He slammed his hand down on the table. So the silverware jumps and everybody in the restaurants went silent. And no way, he said, it will be LaGuardia or I will splinter this party. And they agreed. So he did get elected. And in this little montage, in little or in much, do not act corruptly. That's the judge. That's my input, because I do believe one of the most important things in the LaGuardia administration, he showed that government does not have to be corrupt. After Tammany, it had a century of that. And to show this, to demonstrate this, his first official act was to cut his own salary in half, because he knew he would be firing people, reducing salaries, et cetera, and he wanted to live by example. So here's the new mayor and the Goo-Goos. Goo-Goos are what the good government people, as Tammany called them, in sort of an ironic fashion. But as I say, without Seabury, he would probably not have become mayor. So we have a lot to thank him for. So we look at the first 100 days. He was called Midget Mussolini. and Lightspeed CEO. And as he said, in this administration, I am the majority. This is the gauntlet he laid down to the aldermen because he knew how corrupt they were and he wasn't going to put up with it. He had to fight a battle on two fronts. The first was with the federal government and the second was the city and state government. On the federal side, there was the Civil Works Administration under Harry Hopkins. He was very generous with his money, but these were short-term projects. The Public Works Administration under Harold Ickes funded larger infrastructure projects like, say, the Triborough Bridge, for example. But he was tight-fisted and very slow. He liked to keep control of the money. So LaGuardia went to Washington, basically, after he was elected and spent a couple of months down there helping these guys to invent projects. But these were serious projects. No one had ever done this before. No one had ever asked the federal government to become so deeply involved in city finances and building programs. And the keys to these projects were always feasibility and jobs creation. So weeks before the inauguration, he was already signing contracts with vendors so that he would hit the ground running day one. And his biographer says by the time he took office, New York had captured 20% of all the job slots allocated by the CWA. He was a real doer. City and state government, remember, this guy has more problems than the president. The president only has to go through two houses of Congress. He had to go through Congress, all these bureaucrats in Washington, plus the Board of Aldermen, plus the New York State Assembly, plus the New York State governor. And he wanted to basically take autocratic powers from day one because Tammany had left the city with this enormous financial problem, huge debts, 330 million, high interest, short term, on a budget of 551 million. So they were literally going broke day by day. He put forward this emergency economy bill, gave him this kind of autocratic power to merge bureaus, cut costs, fire people, etc. On the second day, he compromised, made it 9 months, not 2 years that he had the authority. This was acceptable both to the Board of Aldermen and the New York State Assembly. But Governor Lehman then wrote this 12-page veto threat accusing LaGuardia of taking dictatorial powers. He went right to Albany, met with Lehman, compromised, removed parts of the bill, and so Lehman was happy. And in addition, Roosevelt sent word to Lehman that federal funds to Albany would be cut if they didn't cooperate with LaGuardia. And then Tammany came into the picture at the end of January, so that the bill was actually rejected in legislature. They forced the legislators to vote against it. After a couple of months, they finally compromised, and he did get that legislation. It was a little bit different than the original, but it allowed him to take action. So hit the ground running was the mantra of the first term: never stop and reinvent. I mean, those were the three things they were really doing. He had picked some of the most talented people as his commissioners and department heads ever in any city government. These were professionals, the best people in their field, including Robert Moses. He did not have a city position until LaGuardia named him to the head of the New York Parks Commission. So he had city and state positions now. Langdon Post was one of the leaders in housing reform. Louis Valentine was a incorruptible police officer who had been relegated to the police version of Siberia during the Tammany years and now was named commissioner. The same with the guy at fire department, et cetera, et cetera. And the last people down here, William Carey, sanitation, was the guy who did the excavation of the Panama Canal. So he was very serious about who he picked. And he made people work hard. There's Robert Moses saying, work around the clock, and they meant it. He got this feedback that the engineers said they couldn't get any sleep. So he went out and bought cots and put them in the halls, offices, and spare rooms of these guys' buildings so that they would keep working. Because one thing we have to understand is they didn't know whether this federal money was going to keep rolling in, because Congress could have stopped it, the courts could have stopped it, or FDR could have lost his reelection bid, and that would have been the end of these programs. So LaGuardia seized this opportunity of all these federal programs to transform construction from what had been mainly a private activity to also a public one. And you can see this in the kinds of things that was achieved. it just in his first term. The Triborough Bridge, the East River Drive. First Houses was the first public housing project and gave a proof of concept to the federal government. Langdon Post put this together with the Astor family. They owned some tenements in Lower Manhattan, and they transformed those into truly, different type of housing with park space, etc. And because of that, they did not use any federal money for that, but they were able to get federal money for the Williamsburg houses and other succeeding housing projects, which were much larger scale because of the success of that one. So you can see the Lincoln Tunnel, many piers, public swimming pools, as we saw when we talked about Robert Moses, subway extensions, public health facilities, etc. And at the same time, he was renovating the New York City Charter, which was long overdue. It had been recommended by Moses back in the 1916-17 era, and had been on the agenda. So they got this done. And finally, there was the victory in the Artichoke War. This was an important battle against the mob. It was the shot across the bow to them because they controlled many of the produce markets. And he wanted to break that control because they were overcharging the consumers. So he went up there with the police, confiscated all the artichokes, basically told the people running it that they no longer had contracts. He found some obscure law that allowed him to do that, and reissued contracts to non-mob companies. So within a few weeks, the price of artichokes had dropped quite dramatically, and everybody was happy except the mob. And much of his success was because of this New Deal bromance, which really was leading to a new city. As Roosevelt said, our mayor is probably the most appealing person I know. He comes to Washington and tells me a great story. The tears run down my cheeks, and tears run down his cheeks. And the first thing I know, he wangled another $50 million. Well, he did, as you can see here, by 1935, he wangled $265 million. This is a headline from the New York Times. But they had a rocky start. Roosevelt tried to block LaGuardia's appointment of Robert Moses to the Parks Commission and the Triborough Bridge Authority. LaGuardia resisted fiercely. He knew he needed Moses to get things done. And he also tried to capture the control of the federal funds for these projects, which he did in spite of Harold Ickes. But after that battle, things got a lot smoother, and LaGuardia was making regular visits to Washington, and New York City even rented an apartment down there for him to visit these key people in the cabinet, as well as people in Congress and FDR himself. So he created a very strong bond there. And he was also president of the U.S. Conference of Mayors from 1935 to 45. Because of that, Roosevelt picked him to take the mayor's chair on what was called the Allotment Advisory Committee, which was the committee that basically recommended new projects for federal funding. And because of that, he also worked very hard for FDR's reelection in 1936, even though he was Republican. He went to major cities and campaigned for him. And also he had 25% of all federal highway funds going to the cities because of his strong advocacy. So in 1937, he comes to his second term. He has new accomplishments, but also visions of a higher office. He loves his job, but he could certainly think of a better one, and it begins with a P, as in president. Again, in 1937, the Republicans tried to block his renomination, given his campaigning for FDR the previous year. But they had really no other candidate, and they knew it would split their party badly and cause them to lose. And instead, the Democrats did them a favor by splitting their party. Al Smith had a falling out with Roosevelt and got the nomination for this Supreme Court Justice, Jeremiah Manny. But as Kessler says, within 4 years, LaGuardia's innovative extensions of municipal responsibility had become the new normal, and no serious candidate, least of all a moderate like Manny, dared to attack it. And FDR didn't even back the Democrat candidate, didn't endorse him. So it was a tacit endorsement of LaGuardia. He won by a landslide. Now there was talk about him possibly as a presidential candidate, as Lincoln of the ghetto, as they called him. In 1940, Roosevelt was in his second term. It was expected or hoped that he might not run again, given that no president had run for more than 2 terms. And LaGuardia was considered a possible presidential or VP candidate. But with the war in Europe and the US preparing for war, it gave FDR kind of the authority to go ahead and run again. And he did, and so that was the end of the ambition of LaGuardia to be president. But one thing you notice here on this re-election is there's this other guy here named Thomas Dewey, who became the prosecutor and teamed up with LaGuardia and Police Commissioner Valentine to really start cleaning up the new city, to extend that war on the artichokes to other parts of the mob, to what they called honest graft politicians, as LaGuardia would call them, chiselers and tin horns. So here's with LaGuardia with one of his publicity stunts, smash them up. He's smashing up all these pinball and slot machines that the mob would force retailers to put in their stores. Police Commissioner Valentine, muss them up. He would strong arm these guys if needed. And Prosecutor Thomas Dewey, lock them up. They did not discriminate. They went after everybody, the Italian mobsters, the Jewish mobsters, the Irish, Tammany crooks. He won 72 of 73 convictions on all of his indictments in a couple of years. It was really a phenomenal record. And here's some of the key ones. Lucky Luciano, the mob boss, got 30 to 50 years. And as he might say, I saved Dewey's life. What an ingrate. One of his other mob friends had told him, I'm going to kill Dewey because he's going to get us all if not. And this guy told him, no, don't do that because you'll have the whole government on you then. So the guy said, no, I'm going to. So he put out a hit on the other mobster, saving Dewey's life. Waxy Gordon led the bootlegging and gambling industries in New York. He got a 10-year sentence for tax evasion. As he would say, Meshuggah, Lucky, and Lansky ratted me out. Lucky, Luciano, and Meyer Lansky, the Italian and Jewish mob chiefs, combined to give evidence against him to Dewey to put him in jail because they wanted him out of the picture. And lastly, Jimmy Hines, the Tammany kingpin, got 13 counts of racketeering, was sentenced 4 to 8 years. As he might say, should I can't get out of this with just a bit of the old blarney. And he had plenty of that. Another must-have for LaGuardia for his new city was airports. He knew that global travel was going to be a prominent feature of the next decades. So he did something everyone called Fiorello's folly. He acquired acreage out around Curtis Field, filled it in with PWA dollars to build an expanded airport, which eventually became LaGuardia. It was an enormous project, 5,000 men working 3 shifts around the clock, 6 days a week for 2 years. They wanted to have it ready for the 1939 World's Fair, and they did get it ready. It was the most modern airport at the time, the longest runway, the brightest tower beacon. It was no longer his folly. 350,000 people attended the opening in 1939. And he had had a pioneering novelty, this was his idea, to offer leases to retail business willing to serve airport consumers in the terminal, like banks, restaurants. David Rockefeller managed the program. It was hugely successful, generated over 100,000 annual rent. And later he bought another piece of land out in Queens called Idlewild, which is the airport that I landed at in 1958 from Ireland, before it was called JFK. So his third term comes along. Again, here's a quote from Thomas Dewey. I shouldn't do this for the SOB, but we're going to give him the endorsement again. They reluctantly renominate him. Brooklyn's DA, William O'Dwyer, is a Democratic nominee. By this time, LaGuardia was very short-tempered. His nerves were pretty frazzled. He'd been working very long days for 8 years. And some people started to say, well, maybe he should step back, but he didn't. It was a very dirty election. He did win, but by a close victory. And at this time, he also got a more federal role. So he was wearing multiple hats. Roosevelt named him chair of the US-Canada Joint Defense Board. He was head of the Office of Civil Defense nationally in the US. So he was going back and forth between Washington, sitting in on cabinet meetings, and then coming back to New York to work as a mayor. He started having health problems and a lot of stress issues. His relations with the press became pretty frayed at this point. And finally, he just decided with Roosevelt to have somebody else take over the OCD. As he said, sin does not pay. I'm about to give up my dual life. And one more mayoral model of success was his crisis management. And this regards a riot in Harlem that took place in 1943. The Black population had increased by 40% in his terms. He had done more for this group and for the Italians and Jews and every other group than any other previous mayor, with public housing, health centers. He required the police, fire, transit, and relief agencies to hire African Americans. He ordered the city hospitals to hire Black doctors and nurses. And he pressed Roosevelt to enact the Fair Employment Practices Act. But at the same time, Adam Clayton Powell Jr., who was also a great orator and showman, came along and wanted more. He wanted a more prominent position for Blacks in politics. He called it the double V, victory overseas in war and victory at home against discrimination. This was a summer of many race riots. The worst was in Detroit in June, where 34 people died. He immediately took preemptive actions, LaGuardia. He used his regular radio address to calm passions. He put together committees with Black leaders to improve race relations, and he asked the police commissioner to promote more Black officers and limit gun use to self-defense. In any case, this did not stop a riot from starting on August 1, based on a false rumor that a policeman had killed a soldier. He immediately, at 9 o'clock at night that day, went up to Harlem, set up a command post with Commissioner Valentine and the fire chief. He ordered all police to remain on duty. He calls in an army detachment and deputized 1,500 Black volunteers, who obviously he had selected in advance, to fan out and keep the peace in Harlem. He travels himself with Black leaders on a flatbed truck, telling people to go home. The soldier was not killed. He sealed off Harlem. He put a curfew. And he told the people who were rioting, if you're violent, we're going to stop you. So the riot ended in 36 hours with 6 deaths, a lot less than Detroit. But he didn't stop after that. He realized that there were injustices that need to be remedied. He used his judicial power to fight discrimination, including against the very powerful MetLife insurance company, which ran many of the newer housing projects and were discriminating against Blacks. He also added other new Harlem initiatives. He even won over Adam Clayton Powell, who praised his wise and effective leadership in this matter. So his legacy is he's considered the greatest American mayor, the most successful, and the model for good government. He entered office in January 1934 with 5 main goals. All were achieved: restore financial health, expand federally funded work relief programs, end corruption, replace patronage with a modern civil service, modernize the infrastructure, especially transportation and parks. And how he did this, one was the revision of the New York City Charter. It was an unwieldy, ancient document which no longer applied to a modern city. He created a new city legal and administrative structure where government is expected to provide professional management, infrastructure, systems, services that facilitate individual initiative, commerce, education, and cultural activities. He hired the best people, and he worked in a hands-on way with them. And he was the first to link cities directly to the federal government with new financing models enabling larger projects to modernize cities, expand transportation, and do all these other things that needed to be done. He also did a lot of other things that we don't hear too much about. He modernized the subway system by buying out the failing private owners of those operations. And he added miles of new track, including taking some of those L trains down underground. He made New York City a world destination with 2 state-of-the-art airports. He created the first public-private health insurance for middle and lower income, HIP, which I believe is still there today in New York. And he was incorruptible. As the great Lucky Luciano said, I just couldn't understand that guy. We offered to make him rich. He wouldn't even listen. And finally, he pioneered the use of radio even before FDR. He was doing a report from Congress in the 1920s, and he did weekly talks to the people Sunday afternoons when he was mayor. He also did a program called Mayor La Guardia Calling Rome in Italian. It was during the war, World War II, to help the US war effort and to help the Italians understand what we were doing to liberate them. Mayor La Guardia reads the comics. Everybody knows when the transportation strike took place, the newspapers were not delivered, so he felt the kiddies need to have their comics, and he would be the one to read them to them over the radio. So lastly, just a few thoughts. This first one is from Robert Moses. As remember, he had an interest in poetry. This is something he wrote about LaGuardia after his death. The mayor seemed to have a vision, not of the Statue of Liberty, calm, static, dignified, lifting her lamp beside the golden door. That's the Emma Lazarus poem that she was referring to, that's at the Statue of Liberty. But of the fleur-de-lis himself, his torch, a flaming sword, riding the whirlwind of reform, directing the storm of progress, straight into the millennium. LaGuardia himself was a bit more prosaic when they asked him, what are you most proud of? And this is important. I raised the standard of municipal government everywhere in this country by raising it in New York, and so proving it could be raised. And this goes back to the visionary. A mayor who cannot look 50 or 75 years ahead is not worthy of being in City Hall. And thank you very much. I do have a bibliography at the end. If anybody wants to have it, I'd be happy to send it through Pat. And any questions, I'd love to hear what you think.
It looks like Mary wants to know what's the best biography on LaGuardia.
The best biography is probably the one by Thomas Kessner. It's the most detailed. He had access to LaGuardia's documents because he was head of the LaGuardia collection at CUNY.
And she also wants to know where in Ireland you're from.
Cork.
I have a few hands.
A beautiful city if you ever get there.
What is the origin of his name, Little Flower?
Well, it was a family name. His grandmother was named Fiorina, which is the feminine of Little Flower. He named his daughter Fioretta, I think. He was married, but his wife and daughter both died of tuberculosis. The daughter when she was less than 1 year old. They lived in a tenement, and that was one of his reasons he hated the tenements so much and wanted to get rid of them. He did remarry later. His first wife died in 1921 with the daughter, and then he remarried his administrative assistant in 1929, and they made a great partnership and adopted 2 children, one of whom I think is still alive. Was he Catholic? He was not Catholic. He was Episcopalian. His father was Catholic or raised a Catholic, but he left the church because of his experiences with it in Italy. Interestingly, Robert Moses also converted to Episcopalian sometime in his life, and they're both buried at that famous cemetery in the Bronx. What is it, Woodlawn Cemetery? So just one of those curious facts of history.
Okay. This program is being recorded and it will be edited and posted on our YouTube channel, hopefully within the week. Thank you everyone so much for joining us again. And hopefully Mark will be back with us with another topic in the weeks to come. Thank you so much.
Have a great afternoon. Thank you all.